Hello. I'd like to wish everyone here a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, or season's greetings if you prefer that. I'm most grateful for the support I've received here on this channel in 2022, and I look forward to 2023 for all of us. I've written and illustrated a short story in accordance with the traditions that I've laid down in the past couple of years, which people appear to have liked. It's a sort of thank you to my friends here. I hope you enjoy it. Anyway, here it is.
Old Dr. Murgatroyd had been physician at Chipping Wenbury longer than anyone could remember. He knew the villagers and their ailments, real and imagined, and as Christmas approached and the cold weather brought in an icy draught of coughs, colds, and influenzas of the male and female varieties, he was much in demand. It was therefore a blow when he had to leave the village to attend to a sister who had become ill. He arranged for a stand-in, a locum, to fill his practice in his absence. The locum arrived at the station at 3:30 the following day. Will Paling, who was sent to collect the doctor, quickly identified him by virtue of the fact that he was the only person to alight at the Chipping Wenbury stop. The doctor emerged unsteadily, a little furtive in his manner when Paling hailed him. He was dressed in a check suit and a bow tie, a flat cap was on his head, and he carried a small bag which Paling presumed contained his medical instruments. The doctor looked rather nonplussed to find himself greeted on his arrival. "Doctor," began Paling. "My name's Nobby," said the man, cautiously. "I'll take your bag, Dr. Nobby," said Will Paling, and drove him off to his lodgings above the small surgery in the High Street. Dr. Nobby held his first surgery the following morning. He looked a little nervous when he discovered a waiting room of prospective patients there. He was quite sober, and took a couple of swigs from a whisky flask to remedy this defect, and thus fortified, his first patient was called in. Tommy Entwistle was a regular visitor, Monday mornings prompt. He had had every malady known to man, and some which were not known to him. There were those in the village, including the good Dr. Murgatroyd, who considered him to be an unmitigated hypochondriac. "I think I may have caught something," he said pitifully. The doctor looked momentarily alarmed. "Well, why have you come in here to breathe all over me?" he demanded indignantly. "You're the doctor," replied Mr. Entwistle. Unable to think of a suitable rejoinder, Dr. Nobby said, "Well, what is the matter with you?" "I'm not a well man," said Entwistle, pointing at his chest and head vaguely. "Do you think it's catching?" inquired Nobby anxiously. "I was hoping you'd tell me," persisted Entwistle. The doctor clicked his tongue impatiently. He was off to a shaky start, but moments later he managed to bundle Mr. Entwistle out with instructions to cheer up. He fared little better with his next patient, Mrs. Jolly. He took a dislike to her very quickly. "I have a septic boil on my foot," she told him. "Do you want to see it?" "Not really," he informed her. It was a difficult morning for the new doctor, and he found as it progressed he had a great need of his own particular brand of medication, which he took liberal swigs of between patients. It had a pleasing transformative effect on him, and it elevated his mood no end. If it didn't improve the accuracy of his diagnoses, at least they were delivered with great aplomb. He was finding his stride. Fred Bembridge presented himself, a pale and worried man. Dr. Nobby applied his stethoscope to Bembridge's chest and listened. "That's the right side you're listening to, Doctor," ventured the knowledgeable Bembridge. "Yes," said Dr. Nobby. "Well, my heart is on the left." Dr. Nobby smiled indulgently at this widely held misconception of the mere layman. "Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't," he said. "Are you sure?" asked the astonished Fred Bembridge. "Of course I am." He spoke with finality. "They're tricky things, hearts," he told him. "Sometimes they're one place and sometimes another. Sometimes they start out on the left and move over to the right, and vice versa. You never can tell." Fred Bembridge looked unconvinced. "But I thought—" he began. Dr. Nobby drew himself up imperiously to his full 5 feet 3.5 inches. "After 10 years' study at the University of Oxbridge, I think I might know my business," he told him. At last he put aside the stethoscope. "Well, Doctor?" inquired Fred anxiously. Dr. Nobby stared at a Victorian print of a hunter and a rabbit on the wall. "It's not good news, I'm afraid," he said at last. "What is it?" asked Fred. Dr. Nobby pursed his lips and tapped them thoughtfully with a forefinger. He was still eyeing the rabbit on the wall. It didn't look healthy, he thought to himself. At last he turned to his patient. "You have mixing me toes up," he pronounced impressively. Fred sat up. He was feeling increasingly unwell, although he had not been in the surgery 3 minutes. "What? It's as bad a case of mixing me toes up as I've seen." "I've never heard of it," moaned Fred. "There's nothing can be done," the doctor said, shaking his head sorrowfully. Fred's legs felt like jelly. The disease with which he was afflicted was clearly working quickly upon him. He could sense it, seemingly from the feet up. That would be the mixing me toes up bit, he thought. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You had best get off home and enjoy your last few days." "Days?" said Fred, half choking. "Yes, that's what I said," replied Dr. Nobby. "But I was hardly ill when I came here," he stammered. "That's how it always starts," said the doctor sorrowfully. Fred opened his mouth to speak, and finding no words came, concluded the disease was advancing at an alarming rate. He stumbled from the surgery, mixing not only his toes up, but his legs as well, as he made his way home. His gait was so uncertain, and his legs so wobbly by the time he reached his house, he wondered if he would last the night. He went straight to bed in a state of collapse. Next morning, to his astonishment, he found he was still alive, though his condition had not improved. The doctor was called out to him, and Dr. Nobby arrived at 11:15. After studying his patient, admiring some of his silverware, and helping himself to a tumbler full of whisky from the sideboard, he said, "It might be possible to save you, but it's not cheap. How much money do you have?" Fred, it seems, had only 7 shillings. 7 shillings? I'll take those candlesticks as well, and you can owe me the rest, he said, with a sudden burst of generosity, and drew a bottle from his pocket, which he handed over to his stricken patient. "Take 2 tablespoons each day," he told him. It may have been expensive, but there is no doubt it was successful. Fred recovered the use of his toes and his legs, and was delighted. Of course, news spread quickly of his miraculous recovery from mixing me toes up, and the doctor's stock in the village rose considerably. Next day, Bob Sims, the village postman, came in with a sprained ankle. He had turned it in a pothole in Bronsbury Road, and he was hoping the doctor could give him a liniment to ease his discomfort. It was worse than he thought. Dr. Nobby looked gravely at his swollen ankle. "It has to come off," he said. "What?" shouted Sims. "It's the only thing for it," Nobby assured him. Mr. Sims kicked up a quite unnecessary fuss over this. "You've got 2 of them," the doctor pointed out. "I need both of them for dancing," said Bob Sims hoarsely, who was known amongst the ladies of the village as being an excellent dance partner. "Ah, dancing is easier on one leg," the doctor informed him. "You don't have as much to think about. You only have to think where to move the one leg, instead of always having to bother about the 2 of them." However persuasive this argument, Bob Sims did not seem to be entirely convinced by it. "I won't be able to walk to do my post round," he persisted. "Well, see if you can hop about a bit," suggested Dr. Nobby, wanting to be helpful. Bob Sims obliged, and surprised himself how adeptly he negotiated the surgery. Encouraged by his success, he also took a couple of turns round the waiting room, where he encountered a surprised but wholly supportive audience. Meanwhile, Dr. Nobby looked thoughtful. "I haven't fully made my mind up yet," he said. "Not fully. It could go either way at the moment, now that I think of it." This was encouraging news indeed. Although Bob was warming to the advantages of simpler dance moves, he was also mindful of the tiring effects of standing on one leg all the time. "What can you do?" he inquired. "There's a medicine. It's expensive. The Doctors' Guild don't like us handing it out. They want to save most of it for themselves, but I can give you a bottle of it for a price, and you take a couple of spoonfuls of it every night." Bob Sims, for whom standing on one leg had lost some of its charm, was all gratitude. Dr. Nobby gave him a bottle of the coveted medicine, which resembled in many ways a whisky bottle, although it sported a label clearly stating it to be medicine. Sims took his first dose there and then, and remarked that the medicine tasted like whisky. Dr. Nobby took a whole beakerful of the medicine too, just for companionship. "It is similar in some ways," he conceded. Bob Sims' dancing career was saved. 2 days later, and £10 shorter, a grateful Bob went happily on his rounds, hopping just to be on the safe side. Dr. Nobby took to holding impromptu surgeries at the Dog and Whistle pub each evening. Sometimes his diagnoses were quick, intuitive ones. Sometimes he ruminated long and hard over a particularly difficult case, while the patient, hovering between life and death, stood him several drinks. He was often to be seen reviewing his encyclopedic medical knowledge whilst playing a game of billiards, before pronouncing his diagnoses, sometimes identifying a common and benign ailment, occasionally a rare and regrettably fatal one. His prognosis often seemed, to the uncharitable, to depend on what kind of mood he was in at the time. That's how it was with Peter Jenkins, a cowman up at Smollett's farm. He went to see Dr. Nobby after a cow had butted him the day before, and left him with some bruising. It was much more serious than he had thought, as it turned out. Dr. Nobby examined him, having lost 3 games of billiards in a row. At length he said he didn't like it. Coaxed excitedly by those around him to specify exactly what he didn't like, he said, "In all my life I have seen only one case of this. That was in darkest Africa years ago, and the man only lived for 4 days in agony. It took him so badly." Peter was stunned. He walked slowly, painfully over to the billiards table and lay down on it, moaning, and refused to move. Eventually the landlord ordered him off the billiard table, owing to the condition of his boots. He had come direct from the farmyard after all, so he lay on the floor instead. Dr. Nobby was not a man without compassion, and when Peter's old father begged him to help his son, he said he would do what he could to save him. He was a man of his word, too, and it is a credit to his medical skills that young Jenkins was up on his feet within a day. Dr. Nobby spoke candidly on that occasion, taking the others into his confidence. "It's the medical establishment," he said. "It's the hypocritic oath that all doctors are forced to swear, not to let on the secrets of the trade. A bit like the Masons. We're only allowed to save so many people, or we get into trouble with the Doctors' Guild," he explained darkly. "Why's that?" inquired Job Findlay, whose sister had recently passed away whilst in the care of old Dr. Murgatroyd. "It's obvious." Here he lowered his voice. "If everyone gets better, doctors will be out of business. There's overpopulation, and don't forget," he added, "we always need bodies for practicing on." There was general dissatisfaction over this in the bar. "I don't like it," he said firmly, agreeing with them. "Never have." He grew severe upon his fellow doctors as he warmed to his theme, and when Job Findlay pressed him on the matter of his dearly departed sister, Dr. Nobby called Dr. Murgatroyd one of the worst murderers who had ever lived. That was a considerable shock to the company in the pub, who hitherto had had a great affection for old Dr. Murgatroyd. "I got in trouble once when one of my patients lived to be 140, he told them expansively. "On average, we are allowed to save only 4 out of every 20 people. "It's the law," he said, banging his fist on the table, glancing round as if to count those in the pub. People shuffled their positions nervously, according to where his gaze fell, in the hopes of being one of the fortunate four. After Dr. Nobby had left the pub, there was much discussion. They scanned their collective memory for proofs of his veracity. There was no shortage of these. "Remember young Mr. Fotheringay," said one. "He was fit as a fiddle when he died." They considered this. "He wasn't as fit after that," said Bill Caldwell at length. There was no disputing that. Of course, not everyone followed this logic. Dickie Prendergast, for instance, said, "But young Mr. Fotheringay was 96. "Yes, but he wasn't 140 like Dr. Nobby's patient, was he?" No one could think of an answer to this. It was true enough. Properly considered, young Mr. Fotheringay had been taken in his prime. It was a disconsolate bunch of men who left for their homes that night, walking in twos as far as they could, fearful of shadows and lurking doctors. Dr. Nobby's surgery flourished as proofs of his competence and goodwill grew. The recovery from the most serious of ailments, both known and unknown to man, was a wonder. It was moreover abundantly clear to all that he was openly flouting the Doctors' Guild's injunctions against saving too many people. On one day alone, Dr. Nobby saved 4 men, 3 women, and 2 boys who had developed a 100% fatal form of bubonic plague, masquerading somewhat sneakily as a sniffle. And the following day he gave out preventative potions to no less than 15 people at 12 shillings a bottle to prevent them catching a deadly dose of the disease. "They said they would make me a lord if I didn't save so many people," confided Dr. Nobby modestly to his admirers that evening at the Dog and Whistle. "But I wouldn't do it if they made me a duke." Such was the integrity of Dr. Nobby. It gained him many drinks that evening, too. Some said drink was getting the better of him, because his diagnoses became bolder as the evening progressed. Fred Appleby's deafness was attributed to his failure to buy a round when it was his turn, rather to any physical cause. Dr. Nobby also said Sam Taylor was likely to find an improvement in his eyesight if he was to take note when his glass was almost empty. He was likewise scathing of Jem Gosling's memory loss, who seemed to have forgotten he owed him £5 for saving his life at Monday's surgery. Mr. Gosling's retort to this was such that Dr. Nobby offered to fix his nose for him, an operation he would perform on an outpatient basis there and then. The doctor was decidedly the worse for wear as he left the pub. If he had declined a peerage from the Doctors' Guild, then he was certainly drunk enough to qualify for one. Of course, this all lends a rosy hue to Dr. Nobby's tenure at Chipping Wembury. He had his failures. He warned 92-year-old Mr. Ponsonby to lay off the women. The estimable vicar's wife was advised to find herself a young lover, and he offered a dipsomaniac tailor, Peter Malloy, a drink. His diagnosis of old Colonel Prothero's wife, too, was surprising. She came to him with what she believed to be lumbago, only to learn she was with child. She was 64 and quite surprised by this, incredulous even, and took considerable umbrage at his lecture to her on family planning. When she protested against his diagnosis, his attitude became severe. He accused her of carnal relations with Bert Webster, who had beaten him at darts the previous evening. Bessie Craddock, top-heavy barmaid at the Dog and Whistle, who kept company with the grocer's assistant, and whose sudden and unexplained weight gain was the subject of much speculation in the village, was likewise astonished to be told that she was clinically obese. He chided her sternly on account of her fondness for pork pies at the Dog and Whistle, which left none for customers who were ravenous after playing billiards. Of course, mistakes of this kind are easily made. What doctor hasn't made them? But it may have been Mrs. Prothero's indignation which caused her to speak to her husband, Colonel Prothero, who happened to be the chief constable of the county. Whatever its cause, he had a word with Superintendent Bligh, who in turn spoke to his constable, a man named Alfie Rowbottom. He told Alfie to look into the matter. Alfie did. He cycled there directly that morning. Dr. Nobby was a little nervous when Alfie showed up, but apparently showed him a certificate on which it clearly stated his name and qualifications to be Dr. Norbert Nobby, MD, PhD, Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. That seemed to clinch it. The two men shared several convivial glasses of whisky, and P.C. Rowbottom cycled back to the station in excellent good humour. He was happy to inform his superintendent that Dr. Nobby was a fine doctor, but while doing so, he suddenly stopped. His gaze was transfixed on the wall behind his senior officer. He pointed to it. "What's Dr. Nobby's picture doing there?" he exclaimed. The super followed the direction of Alfie's finger. "What's that?" he queried. "What is Dr. Nobby's picture doing there?" repeated Alfie. "That's Nobby Fletcher, worst rogue in these parts," said the superintendent, "a shiftless ne'er-do-well who has spent most of his days in prison." "No, it's Dr. Nobby," Alfie corrected him. "This man Fletcher is a villain," the superintendent declared with equal conviction. A short discussion, lasting for an hour and 3/4, ensued, in which the two defenders of the law discussed how Dr. Nobby's picture had come to be mixed up with that of a villain called Nobby Fletcher. Neither man could make head nor tail of it, and in the end could think of nothing else but to go over and see if Dr. Nobby could clear the matter up. But alas, by the time the officers arrived at the High Street practice, Dr. Nobby, whose resemblance to Nobby Fletcher, a man wanted for petty larceny, chicken rustling, jaywalking, and loitering with intent, was quite striking, had vanished. Inquiries elicited that the medical man was last seen hurriedly clambering aboard the 3:27 for London. Dr. Nobby was never seen again. There are some writers who have held that Dr. Nobby and Nobby Fletcher were one and the same, but that seems to be a fanciful notion, and there is no evidence for it. The general consensus of the village is that there is nothing more than a passing similarity of name and feature, no more, between the two men. Furthermore, they hold that Nobby Fletcher could not possibly be Dr. Nobby, because if he had spent all those years in prison, when could he have found time to have studied to be a doctor for 10 years? Also, why had no one else diagnosed or even heard of the fatal malady mixing me toes up? And what of all the others he saved? Dr. Nobby, in spite of being restricted by the Doctors' Guild to save only 4 out of 20, had saved them all. And what of Postman Bob Sims, whose dancing days had nearly been over, but who was, to this day, possibly from overcaution, still to be seen hopping along the street upon his rounds? And finally, no one, absolutely no one, has ever offered a convincing explanation as to how one of Dr. Nobby's patients lived to be 140. In the end, the village concluded that Dr. Nobby had fallen foul of the medical establishment. The Doctors' Guild had it in for him for saving so many lives. It is a shame, such people insist, that a man who had refused a dukedom in the service of his patients had been treated no better than a common criminal.